Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. We are talking about something that people really need to consider. Just like buying a practice for the first time, starting a practice for the first time, you need to educate yourself before making one of these life-changing decisions. You need to really know how to evaluate a practice. Some people spend more time buying their car than they do looking at an acquisition, than researching a startup. The same applies to potentially selling your practice to a DSO. You need to educate yourself. And in the last episode, if you haven't listened to that episode, go back and listen to my co-host, Dr. Scott Leune, and I talk about why it really doesn't make sense in so many cases that you're giving your practice away when you sell to a DSO. And the question today is, does it ever make sense? And if it does, how do we not screw it up afterwards? Because there's a whole nother set of problems of having a lump sum of cash on your hands that is life-changing, but you have to not screw it up. So, Scott, welcome back. And I'm excited for part two.
Yeah, so the rare kind of conditions that have to be in place where selling a practice to a DSO might make financial, logical sense, right? That's what we're going to talk about. I'd rather us not waste time rehashing what was on the previous episode about how to calculate the value of a practice based on EBITDA and the terms and the employment agreements that are typically accompanied when you sell to a DSO. And how about you start this off? When might we sell to a DSO where, like Scott or Richard says, okay, that was actually probably worth it?
Yeah. There's the financial side of this, but having been through just some crash and burn midlife crisis type stress recently in the last couple of years, a realization I've had is that any time, and this comes from talked with like 80 dentists in the past few months who are in similar situations of stress, burned out, feeling trapped. That word trapped comes up so often when you have sold or bought a practice or started a practice. Maybe you didn't have the help you needed. You're in a bind. Everything looks good on the surface. Financially, it's not. You're stressed. The same feeling of feeling trapped by a non-ideal situation in practice ownership, the pains and the burden of practice ownership, you can feel very trapped by that employment agreement we talked about in the last episode of, I am now working for someone who is not me after having worked for me for so long. And I will never sell a practice that I have to stick around for. So that would be the thing that I would start with. After being miserable, just feeling like I'm trapped and I don't know what to do, I don't know where to go. This isn't suited for me. Not that it's a bad thing, it's just not suited for me. Some people might like working for a DSO who's, provided all these things that they wanted. That's where I start, is I'm not going to work back for someone.
Yeah. So if I come at that same thing from the logical side, not the emotional side, but the side that just like, okay, I know, if I have to sign an employment agreement for 5 years, that is in essence making me work, losing 5 years of profit I would have had I just owned it during that time.
Yep.
Right. So what if we just coin a term right now called the net multiple? The net multiple is the multiple of EBITDA you get for your purchase price minus the number of years you're required to work as an employee to that buyer.
And you could even add and practice debt and taxes.
Yeah, but the practice debt and taxes, yeah, we could add that as well. So let's just have some assumptions. Let's say we've got a really fat, beautiful valuation of a single practice at a multiple of 6, but they want us to work 5 years. We owe 2 times EBITDA in debt, and we're going to have to pay whatever's left over, a third of that to the taxman. Let's just assume. All right. So we got offered a 6. They're making us work 5 years. So we got to subtract 5 from 6. And so now we're down to 1. We owe 2. Well, shoot, subtract that from 1. We're at -1. And then we're going to have to pay a third taxes on the 6 minus the debt, probably. So we're going to owe another 1.5 and taxes. So in this example, we actually lost 2.5 times EBITDA, thinking we sold for 6 times EBITDA. Let me do that math again. All right, our practice has an annual EBITDA. Let's just, for easy math, just to be silly, let's just say it's 100,000 a year of EBITDA. Okay, for easy math.
I was going to say 1 million, because if we're like really starting to think into this world of
Okay.
when it would be worth it, let's play with 1 million.
Okay, let's play. We got $1 million of EBITDA. So we've got a $5.5 million of collections organization across 4 locations, and we're sell this whole thing, and we got $1 million in EBITDA. And they value this thing at a 6, which is nice. So now they've said, we'll give you $6 million. Okay. But we owed $2 million in debt. So we get the 6, then we got to pay off the debt. We're left with 4. Well, now we're going to have to pay 1.5 in taxes. Okay. So now we're not left with 4, we're left with 2.5. But then they said we were going to have to work for 5 years. So that's 5 years we got to be there, but we don't get the profit anymore. We're going to give up those 5 years of profit. So we were left with 2.5, and now to get to this net, we're going to subtract 5. So now we've got negative 2.5. Had we not sold, had we just worked 5 years and then sold and walked away, we'd have way more money, way more money. We'd have 2.5 times EBITDA positive, not 2.5 times negative, right? The swing here was the fact we had to work. That was the swing. That was what made this whole deal terrible. So, when I now look at this and say, okay, when does it make sense to sell to a DSO? On one level, to me, it makes sense if that net multiple is advantageous compared to selling to anyone else. So if I'm making the decision to sell, do I choose to sell to a DSO? Well, yeah, if they have the best offer. Well, what's the best offer? The highest net multiple. I might have a private buyer only offer me 4 times EBITDA, but lets me walk away. That's a better offer than 6 times EBITDA, but I have to stay for 5 years. Does that make sense?
It does. And to combine the two sides of this that we talked about, I brought up the irrational emotional side. You brought up the logic and the numbers. In general, if you can walk away, that's a net multiple you're not having to subtract out, as well as not having to go through working for someone else in a practice that you build and used to be the owner of. So that's my first benchmark is, can I walk away in the sale? And if you are still practicing clinically, any degree, even if it's just some specialty work that's making the practice extra profitable, it becomes a lot harder, and they start subtracting out EBITDA if you're not there doing that dentistry and you're not doing that specialty dentistry. So I think whether it's one practice that's a large 4-doctor practice and you've removed yourself from that practice, or it's 5 offices and you are not working, you're a managing doctor, owner of these practices, I think if this is the route you're going, that might be a first step is, can I remove myself completely clinically from this practice or these practices?
Well, if you're willing to still work a little or work a lot, but if you're just willing to still work after the sale, excuse my language, but I think you're a complete freaking idiot if you don't calculate the net multiple, which counts for the multiple that you get plus or minus the employment agreement, minus taxes, minus the debt, where you get a net multiple. If you don't compare net multiple to different options, you're an idiot, because you may as well just give away your practice for free so often if you're still willing to work. But like we said, if you don't have to work, that gives you a really big change on your net multiple. So maybe it makes sense to sell to a DSO if for some reason you were able to get a deal that said you didn't have to stay on. And so how do we get that kind of a deal? Because it's very unusual to get a deal from a DSO that says you don't have to stay on. I've gotten a deal like that before. I would imagine you're going to get a deal like that if I were to predict the future. And one thing that we both have in common is before bringing on any sort of investor, before selling what we have, we in essence pulled ourselves out of the business in a way. We weren't doing dentistry anymore. We were not a producer of revenue that the DSO would mandate that stays after they buy it. And so that's a big thing to do to raise your net multiple, is to replace yourself before you go to market so that you can get away signing a 1 month or a 3 month or a 6 month commitment instead of a 1 year, 3 year, or 6 year commitment that you might find yourself having to sign. Does that make sense?
It does, and I wouldn't recommend my route of, crash and burn midlife crisis, removing yourself not only clinically, but even managerially from the business as a whole. You're not even doing anything. You're dead weight, and so they don't just like go away is what the sale would be. So this is such a good point of we need to remove ourselves from the equation, and I think the next point of discussion here is the net multiple that we're getting enough to change our life so that we don't have to work anymore?
Well, that's almost like answering the question, should I even sell or not?
Hmm.
Right? Which is a different question. The first question we started with was, well, when does it make sense to sell to a DSO? But this backing up from that question, should I even sell or not? So to your point, let's say our net multiple is 5 times EBITDA, like net. Let's say we're in that kind of situation, which is great. Well, okay, we get 5 years worth of profit up front, but if we're still living and we got to use our some of that money to live, then we'll burn through it in 5 years. And then what? Then we're just an associate somewhere. Like we're making way less money than we made when we own the practice. So I think where you're going with this is that if we could sell for enough that we're done, we can sell for enough that through our investments alone, we're able to sustain our lifestyle. Then it makes sense to sell. That means we finish the race, like we get a medal saying you're set for life. Like, yes, that's when it makes sense to sell. But if we can't sell for enough money to get us to that point, meaning we're going to have to keep working, we're going to have to burn our sale price, our income we got to live, then that changes everything. Then maybe it's not the right time to sell. It gets way more complicated now on should I sell if it's not enough money to kind of set me for life. So I guess a rule of thumb I may put out there is if we're going to sell, but we can't be done with work, then we need to have the next thing funding us after the sale, right? Then it could make sense. But let's not get caught like an idiot selling our primary income source for some money up front, only to be broke 4 or 5 years later, not knowing what to do and having to start all over. That's so much more painful than keeping and fixing the practice that we worked all this time to have and build. Does that make sense?
It does. And so, I can manufacture, since people like to manufacture situations, I can manufacture a situation where, you know what, actually this makes a ton of sense. So even if it's not life-changing money, if let's say that someone has removed themselves from the practice, they now own one large practice or they own multiple, and they decide they're going to move. They're not going to be in the area anymore. They have put themselves in a situation where they can have pretty close to a walkaway, whether that's 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, like you said. And they don't mind rebuilding. So now let's say that they do get 5X. They're able to walk away in under a year, and they know I'm going to go somewhere else. We're going to move due to family or other reasons. We just want to. And I don't mind rebuilding. All of a sudden, less than life-changing money starts to make sense. But if you're signing a non-compete and you're having to work back, you're having to stay in the area, and you don't have a plan, this is not enough money to make you set for life. All of a sudden you're in the same circumstance. And like you said, the psychology of running out of money in 3 years, 5 years post sale and having to decide, crap, I got to do this all over again. I'm starting from zero, it feels like, and I'm that much further into my career. That's pretty devastating. And I also think there is a real psychological challenge in stepping back. And so this is something else, a whole nother topic of what do I do with my money? How do I protect it and not squander it and end up in that situation? How do I deal with money not being the game that I'm trying to win now? I need to go find other purpose and fulfillment. And if I've spent all of it building something to sell off, in hopes of something else, you need to figure out something to be. So there's a whole nother follow-on set of challenges that could be solved by building a sustainable business that you don't mind sticking around, and then you can sell it at the end. Or you do it right and you walk away, you have life-changing money, and now you have the new job of preserving that and figuring out what to do with your life next.
There's this massive irony about owning and selling a practice. The massive irony is that if you were to invest in help to correct the pain points of the practice, or you were able to correct them yourself, you were to get this practice to a point where it's operating well. The irony of that is that you may not want to sell it at that point. Mm-hmm. And it's worth the most it could be when you do sell it. Just like if you were to be able to step out of the practice of dentistry and in preparation for a sale and correct your expenses and get a consultant in there and like fix it all up and make it perfect and beautiful, the irony is that that's the most valuable practice you could then sell without an employment agreement. But the other side of that irony is that's the perfect practice to not sell and to keep as this asset that you understand and can grow. And so what I think we really should do is first, like, put the thought of selling on a shelf for a second and let that thought collect dust as we optimize the practice as it is today. Let's fix it so that these pain points that are blinding us from seeing rational end and rational paths, right? So that blinding goes away. These pain points go away. And then reassess what we're trying to actually accomplish. Because if we're thinking about selling a dental practice and it's not enough money to set us, and we're thinking about doing it with a DSO or we got to sign an employment agreement, what the heck? Why are you thinking that way? Because can't we see that 5 years later we're screwed? Can't we see that we're also trading one set of pain points for another set of pain points? So, but of course, we're supposed to talk about right now, well, when do we sell to a DSO?
Right.
So let me rehash that a bit. If we can pull ourselves out of the organization, that makes selling to a DSO a lot more attractive if, again, they're giving us the highest net multiple. The reason why they might be in that situation is because, in general, DSOs can give us a little bit higher multiple than what a private dentist could get financed from a bank. And if we don't have the burden of having to sign an employment agreement with them, then we don't have that negative pull against our multiple. Our net multiple might be the higher multiple. So we really do, though, have to spend a little bit of time replacing ourselves. We might have to bring in 2 associates to replace the production that we ourselves do as the owner dentist. Maybe we could still do some of the specialty procedures, or maybe we could do a whole lot of specialty procedures, but just bring in a traveling specialist before we're ready to sell. But we've got to have that path kind of laid out, and we got to walk down that path of replacing ourselves so that our EBITDA doesn't go down, but our time is freed up. Now we are not kind of that key ingredient in this organization to make it successful. We are obsolete in a way. And therefore the DSO may not require us to stay on. And so our net multiple is the highest multiple. So we can go move across the country and start all over, or hopefully, that net multiple is enough that we're set enough for life that we can start a new chapter of our lives in a different way.
In general, one of the takeaways for me from what you said is a similar takeaway. I got to meet Tito of Tito's Vodka, and he built this whole business from scratch, still retains 100% ownership. But one of the takeaways from that was, if you build a business that you have to sell, like you can't hold on to, in order to be happy or in order for it to make sense and be profitable, um, that's a really rough spot to be in. And that is why I am so hesitant when people jump into multi-practice ownership without a plan, without a sustainable, scalable idea of why they're doing this, what they're doing this for, how they're going to make this sustainable for themselves, because they can find themselves 4, 5, 10 practices deep and realize, I hate this. I need to exit. I have to sell this. And all of the sudden, if things kind of get wobbly, the EBITDA starts getting funny, and they don't have a lot of options, then they're up a creek without a paddle, and they've sacrificed so much, they've built so much, and they've not left themselves an option. Whereas if you go into every venture, every business that you ever do, every dental practice, and say to yourself, how can I build a business I don't hate, that is profitable and sustainable? All of a sudden, you have both pathways open to you. You can hold on, like you just said, for perpetuity. This practice doesn't require me. I can just take home profit and not be a primary producer. Maybe have a meeting once or twice a month with my office manager and team leads or my doctors, travel, and still own an asset. Not to mention, we haven't even brought the real estate into this. If someone owns the practice and the real estate, all of a sudden selling might, between the two, there might be enough multiples to get them there to that finish line.
You know what's a lot higher multiple than selling to even like a DSO for like a 5 or a 6? You know what's way higher than that? Is owning the asset you don't have to manage much for the next 30 years. That's a 30-year multiple. I mean, that's like
Yeah.
way higher. And it's not as complicated as what it feels to be when we're in the thick of it. But and that's just talking about one practice, right? And when you go from one to multiple, at one, you have to be able to manage the one with your 5 days a week, maybe. When you go to two, that means they both have to be operating at a healthy level with your 2.5 days a week. So maybe you shouldn't even go to number two until you've gotten number one working on 2.5 days of your time, right? And then you go to number two, and now they have to work on 2.5. And when you go to five, they all get maybe 1 day of your time. It can be that simple. When you look at it that way, like, okay, I own practice one right now. I want to own 5. So I need to go ahead and start this transition of replacing myself. And as I cut back more days, I can add more practices. That's a very healthy way to do it. And especially if you understand what to do with your own time, with specialty procedures clinically, and with your own time from the operational standpoint, the management standpoint. It's a very healthy way to go about it. Some people take a long time to go down that journey of 1 to 5, and some people do it pretty quickly. But in essence, you're trading your clinical time with your leadership time through multiple locations. And there will come a point, of course, down this path where you're now at a no time situation. Now you're not managing practices, you're managing people who are managing practices with your time. That is a journey that most private dentists take at a relatively slow pace. But when you take it too fast, you can break. When you're jumping ahead of yourself, you get into some exponential kind of problems that build up. And they typically kind of crash in big ways, multiple locations at once kind of ways. You're running out of money everywhere kind of a way. You've got a mass exodus of staff kind of thing. So, that all sounds scary. The reality is you're being an entrepreneur, and the assets that you're building are called dental practices. And you're pulling yourself out of working on the assembly line of patient care and instead leading that organization. That, of course, has to be done in a group. But back to this conversation, if we're trying to sell without an employment agreement, it could also be done in a one location organization, right? But that's the irony. Once you're able to do that in a one, would you maybe just want to keep it forever?
Yeah.
Just keep it forever. It may take a lot less time compared to the money you make than investing in Airbnbs or whatever car wash you want to buy or whatever else you're thinking about doing outside of dentistry. You may make a lot more money per time spent in a hands-off kind of, a clinical hands-off kind of practice that you own. And if you could own one forever, gosh, could you own two forever or three forever? Could you leave it to your family forever? It starts changing the types of questions you ask that you're not maybe asking right now because you just feel the crushing weight of having to run the practice you have, and you're so exhausted, and you think that this very tempting kind of path over here toward a DSO is what's going to make sense. I hate to burst the bubble, but it's probably not going to make sense for the vast majority of dentists.
So this has been incredibly enlightening. I do want your opinions, even though neither of us are experts in this field, and the disclaimer here is, please get your own advisors, get your own advice. But I referenced earlier, either in this episode or last episode, the idea that selling then presents itself with new problems. If you have life-changing money, you have to figure out how to invest and protect that money. So, in your opinion, where do people get this wrong, and what can you do to really protect that life-changing money and not lose it, instead of trying all these ventures that you don't have expertise in and losing your shirt after you've done all of this work to build something up and to have a multiple that makes sense and to sell and walk away, and then you lose everything through poor investing and you've got to go back to dentistry and do it all over again. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think for this conversation, I'm going to have to make the distinction that, like, what I'm really going to be talking about is when is it right to park my money to never lose it, as opposed to, I don't want to eat into it. I want to park it. Of course, I want it to grow, but I'm not going to gamble with it, and I'm not going to eat it, right? So I think that there are different stages in our financial life. The first kind of benchmark we want to hit, the first level we want to get to, says we're making enough pay to live the lifestyle we want. Okay, let's never drop below that. So we'll never have to drop our lifestyle down. Let's get to the point where we're making enough pay, which probably means we're working 5 days a week, right? That's kind of the first benchmark that unfortunately so many dentists don't hit early on in their careers.
Right.
Then we get that next benchmark that says, okay, I've now made more than I have to live on, and that extra has built up so that someday when I'm 65 or 70, that extra is enough to fund the rest of my life. So I still have to work until I'm 65 or 70, but I've made enough now that if I just protect it, it'll grow to be enough and I can retire, right? That's the second benchmark. I don't have enough to retire today, but I've got enough today that if I just freaking protect it and don't buy a Ferrari with it, that it will be my retirement, okay? So before I go into the other benchmarks, like, that becomes the next goal, right? Yep. So that's where our focus should be. Then after that level, we get to the point where, like, oh, now it is enough that we've been able to, let's just call it saved up, that I can live off of it and quit working today, and it will fund my retirement. So that means I'm actually set. I'm set for life, okay? And that's a very important moment. And we must not squander that. We must protect that. That says, oh, it's enough now that I can stop now, right? Well, then there's the next level that says, not only do I have enough to stop now, but it's throwing off extra income that I can start investing in other things. And at that point, life can be fun if we have discipline, because we're set for life and we now have the extra money to try the next chapter of our entrepreneurial journey. As long as we have the discipline to not risk the set for life money, but to only play with that extra, then we can be in a very powerful position with how we move forward. So we're going to sell our practice. Well, where does it put us? If we sell that practice, but it's not enough to set us for life now, let alone give us extra, then that means we still got to work, right? And if we still got to work, maybe we might as well still own the practice, because then we get the most profit from it while we're working, right? So I think that we have to get to a point where like selling makes sense logically, and it puts us into one of these upper tiers of being set for life. And then again, I'm saying don't play with any of that money. That money needs to be protected in a very conservative way. If you want to play, if you want to go build the next thing, if you want to go gamble, that's great. That's very fulfilling. You got to earn extra first until you can then gamble for the rest of your life, right? We don't gamble away the set for life money. We might end up with nothing.
That distinction there and that model of these tiers, I think gives anyone listening to this episode, no matter where they are, whether they're a dental student, whether mid-career, late career, a framework to make decisions around. You're either need to make money just to kind of live your lifestyle that you want to. You've got enough to invest extra, and you will eventually, if you follow the plan and you stay disciplined, you'll get there by the retirement age. Or this crucial set for life moment, if you cannot squander it, you can protect it. And then the fun version, which is if you are one who really likes to build things, really likes to do things in the world and make an impact, which I think dentists are that way. Like, how can you not want to build something new, whether it's charitable, whether it's entrepreneurial, whether it's, doing something new and different? Having the option to then invest money into something else, build something else, try something else, do a new career is incredibly liberating and fulfilling, because you can fail. It is ultimate permission to do new things that are not guaranteed and have the chance to really enjoy them without risk in reality. So,
Yeah, and the best way to go down this path, the fastest way to go down this path is to make the most money you can. And the most money people make is almost always owning a company. You make the most money with your time, and you make the money when you sell. You could also get debt against the assets you own to add more assets, and you exponentially increase your valuation, your value that way, and you can exponentially increase your income that way. And so, unfortunately, so many dentists are falling into the trap of just working as a dentist, as an employee, and they are on this very risky, slow path towards kind of this financial freedom that we all intend to achieve. The fastest way you get there is being an owner as soon as possible and being as profitable as you can, and maybe even having more than one location could be in your plan. All of that speeds this up to where you can achieve these kind of higher tier levels of freedom.
So, any other thoughts to wrap up this whole conversation of when it actually makes sense to sell, protecting that, and this big decision that people face all the time? They're faced with all this information, all this pressure, other people who've done it, their good experiences, their bad experiences. How would you wrap this up for us?
Well, usually if you sell and your net multiple is not enough to put you in one of the upper tiers of the financial kind of journey that we're all on, then you probably shouldn't sell right now. Selling is not going to be the most logical thing for you to do. You should probably invest more into the business in making it profitable, making it like something that you can work in for a long time. If, however, you could get a net multiple that is high enough that selling makes sense, then the time that is sold to a DSO is when the DSO is giving you actually the highest net multiple. And that almost always happens if you've pulled yourself out of the practice first. Do not get blinded or distracted by kind of the promises that some DSOs have about the future. You could have options in stock and someday that could be worth a lot, and it's almost like selling twice, and all of that kind of stuff is a distraction to you. You can make way more money focused on your own business, not selling, than putting it into someone else's hands and hoping that market conditions and all the stars align and that you end up getting a decent payday sometime in the future. Don't do that. Don't get swayed by that. Bet on yourself. Bet on your practice. Don't get swayed by what's on a sheet of paper that may never happen. It's not guaranteed. Don't get swayed by that. So because of this, you can see that it's rare that I would recommend selling to a DSO. It's rare. Now, we should talk about, I guess, sometimes the DSO might be the only buyer available to you. That's usually because you haven't looked enough. Because there are private dentists that are buying huge organizations. There are private dentists that have their own kind of version of a DSO, but the deal they're giving you is not a DSO deal, it's a private deal. There are also financial partners that have an operational team and they're wanting to start the next DSO, and they may buy you out with a private kind of deal. There's associates that already work in your practice that you could get SBA loans for, and they may buy your deal at a high valuation. So I challenge you, if you think a DSO is the only company that could buy you, the only kind of company, I challenge you to look elsewhere. So by all means, if you are thinking about selling your practice, get an advisor that can connect you with a whole lot of different types of buyers, that can help you understand the terms of the deal that you're considering doing, that can help you understand the realities of what life is like, the implications to your personal life. Don't do this just out of this emotional reaction to your practice and this assumption that some promise of the future is going to happen. Like, get a professional on your team to help advise and guide you in the most important moment of your financial career.
This is gold. Thank you so much for walking us through this framework, this decision making, when it actually does make sense, but then also pushing back of like, hey, even though on paper you think this makes sense or you think this is your only option, maybe you could just hold this because it is a beautiful cash flowing asset. Or maybe there are private buyers and a DSO is not your only option.
Or maybe you would seller finance it for the part of the multiple that your private dentist couldn't get funding for. You could seller finance that for added benefits to you financially. So much better than having to work more.
Yep, I love it. Well, if our listeners are interested in educating themselves on the options on how to scale a single practice, on how to scale multiple, we teach that. Tell us a little bit about the seminars, where they should go, and how people can give themselves the tools to have these sort of options.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely give these very intense, like 16-hour training seminars that hopefully change how you see your career and how you see the business side of dentistry. Lots of different topics: startups, practice management, multiple locations, being an amazing CEO. Lots of different seminars. Go to my website, scottleune.com. That's Scott, Leune.com. Or you can connect with me on Instagram, dr.scott.leune, and I'd be happy to answer questions. But whether or not I ever see you again, man, please listen to these last couple episodes over and over again until you feel like you completely understand everything we threw out there and every number we threw out there. And only then do you maybe have chapter one of what you need to kind of start making decisions about what to do.
I love it. Thank you so much, Scott. We'll talk to you next time on the Shared Practices podcast.